Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of All in All with Alex. I'm your host, of course, Alex, and today we have a very special guest, Miss Erica. How you doing today?
So well, thanks, Alex. I'm honored to be on your podcast. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Glad to have you here. Glad to have you here. Can you give the people just a brief little background about yourself before we dive into the questions?
Sure. I'm a licensed professional counselor, a therapist here I'm in Colorado, just outside of Denver. I specialize in trauma recovery, predominantly trauma related to childhood abuse, attachment trauma, um, and trauma related to societal oppression. I specialize in serving the LGBTQ community and just other marginalized folks. Um, and then I do a couple different things. I do ketamine assisted psychotherapy. I do a therapy called EMDR, which stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is really good for lessening PTSD symptoms. And then I do some parts work, which is really good for helping heal some attachment wounding and trauma. So yeah, I kind of have my little irons in different fires for sure.
Okay, great. So let's get on into it. So so what inspired you to become a certified EMDR clinician, and how did your journey in counseling begin?
Yeah, so I was actually a breakfast waitress for like 20 years.
Oh,
I figured I better get to something if I didn't want to do that forever. And I started just paying attention that I would be the first person that somebody would disclose their sexual abuse history to. So my mom is actually a sexual abuse survivor. And so I probably became a therapist in some ways at a really young age. Um, and so I decided to go ahead and get a master's in counseling. And then actually, I was working at a community mental health center and they had offered a discounted EMDR training. And I'm a little cynical by nature. I was sort of going into it like, oh, this woo woo stuff, you know. And I actually had a really profound experience in the training because part of the training is you do some experiential EMDR work. And I had this really big shift and release during the EMDR session. And so I was kind of drank the Kool-Aid after that.
alrighty. Um, so can you explain some of the core principles of EMDR therapy and its impact on on trauma recovery?
Sure, sure. So when something traumatic happens, it literally gets stored in isolation in the brain. It doesn't process the way that normal memories do. So, if you park your car, not a traumatic event, your brain will literally file that away and it'll file it away likely in your frontal lobes. But trauma memories are stored in what's called the limbic system. They're stored in isolation from other memories, and they're stored in like that flight or fight amygdala part of the brain. And we see really heavy activation in the right part of the brain, the emotional part of the brain, and less activation in the left part of the brain. And we also see a lot more activation in the limbic system, which is like that flight or fight part of the brain. And so after EMDR, we see a lot more activation in the frontal lobes, and we see a lot more activation between the right and the left brain. The right and the left brain start communicating better. And so what happens in EMDR is considered an 8-phase approach to therapy. And so your therapist is going to start with doing some psychoeducation, hopefully, and then also finding some what's called resources to help regulate your nervous system enough that you can actually look at the trauma, highlight how it's, or, kind of light up the memory, light up how it's currently held in the brain. And then we ask a series of questions like, what's the worst part of the memory? What's the negative belief that you have about yourself as a result of that memory? What are the emotions that you're feeling? Where do you feel it in your body? Sometimes we ask, what do you want to believe about yourself instead? And how disturbing does it feel to you, 0 to 10? And then sometimes we'll move eye movements. You'll follow a light, or if you're on screen, you'll follow, there's certain apps that you can follow with your eyes. I actually just use pulsars that kind of buzz in your hands lightly, from right to left. And that allows you to actually close your eyes and kind of go into your body a little bit more, which a lot of clients like that. They don't, to move your eyes back and forth feels a little disjointed. And actually, I really think that humans have been doing EMDR, quote unquote, since we were drumming and since we were dancing, right? Like drumming, dancing, all of those things are bilateral stimulations, and they help the brain and the body process things. We just now have more of a protocol to actually light up the memory and intentionally use that right left stimulation. We call that bilateral stimulation to help digest and move things through the body.
Okay, so if I'm getting this correctly, basically you're using certain practices to quote unquote awaken that side of the brain to communicate to the other, and then as you're communicating with the person, you're finding out how they truly feel about whatever trauma it was, and then trying to help basically change the feeling, or maybe at least extract that knowledge out so you can better help them overall.
Yeah. And we're really going, so like something like, for example, CBT, right? Which is cognitive behavioral therapy. That's really something that is looking at the negative thinking, and you're trying to intentionally change that thought. And I consider that more of a top down process. You're thinking, and then you're trying to kind of get the lower parts of the brain and body to catch up with that, to believe that. EMDR and trauma work usually requires more of a bottom up process where you're really feeling things in your body, you're feeling things emotionally, and then it almost just happens organically that the thoughts about yourself or the thoughts about the memory kind of organically change. And what happens is those negative memories begin to hook up with more positive memory networks. People are able to say, they can have more compassion for themselves in the memory, or they can have that wider lens, right? Trauma is a very myopic, very tunnel visioned kind of experience, right? And so, and we want that. If you're being jackknifed on a highway, you want very tunnel visioned experience, right? Or thinking. You don't want to be thinking, oh, I wonder if the truck driver's having a bad day today, right? You want good, bad, safe, not safe, go. But then it gets stored in that way. And a lot of times over time, if we have a lot of trauma, we become very, very small, and we're constantly tracking what is safe, what is not safe. We're looking for danger everywhere. And after EMDR, we're just able to hold that bigger picture, hold that more nuanced both and kind of thinking. Like, yes, this impacted me, it really shaped me, and that trauma doesn't have to define who I am.
Basically, just taking control over your trauma, taking
Yeah,
your
and it and
taking your
it's
life back from your trauma.
yeah, it's really happening from the body up. You're not convincing yourself of something.
Gotcha. So okay, so how do you integrate your training as a yoga instructor and mindfulness practitioner into your therapeutic approach?
So yeah, I love that question. Thanks for asking that. I usually start most sessions actually with inviting clients to either close their eyes, or if they're not comfortable with that, to just sort of drop their gaze and start to notice the breath, and start to notice how their body is bracing or clenching or holding things. Because oftentimes the body is the best flashlight as to what's being held in terms of trauma. So I usually don't have people doing poses or anything like that in therapy, but I certainly use breath and mindfulness practice. And mindfulness, a lot of times people think of mindfulness and they think of somebody sort of sitting in lotus position and meditating or whatever. And really, mindfulness is just being fully aware of how things are in the present moment. And a lot of times, things are both hard and brutal, and there's pain there. And hopefully, we can also hold that there is usually beauty, something to also be grateful for, even as we're holding the pain.
So what role does somatic and attachment EMDR play in your work with your
Yeah, thank you. So, okay, so somatic just means body. Soma means body.
okay.
And attachment is really how we attune and relate to both other people, but also relate to ourselves. So, somatic and attachment EMDR is really just a deeper practice. So, just the plain, good old fashioned EMDR, it just by itself is really good for single incident big T traumas, something like a car accident, or if you had one assault or something like that. Just the basic EMDR would be great for that. But most of the time, trauma is multiple things, especially if it's at the hands of a caregiver, or if your caregiver maybe isn't so great at just attuning to your emotions, or like just letting you be angry or sad or whatever it is, or they don't believe you in the trauma, that adds that attachment component to it. And I would say most humans, especially in this country, have the missing experience of having a caregiver that is showing up in a regulated nervous system. I mean, it's a missing experience for my kids sometimes, right? And I do my best, but I'm an imperfect human. And so when they're bitching about not having blueberry cream cheese in the frickin' refrigerator, I really try to validate their precious feelings, but at the same time, I'm like, oh, I'm raising entitled white boys and I don't want to do that. And you know, I show up unregulated. And so the best that we can do is, hopefully offer repair and find a good balance of boundary setting and such. But the most of us, if we were mad, if we were sad, if we were scared, we would either have parents try to talk us out of it, they would get angry themselves, they would punish us for having feelings, they would, try to feed us or make us feel better about it, rather than just like, yep, you're angry. And it makes sense that you're angry. I'm glad you're talking to me about it. How can I help you? That resonance, the attunement, that nerve, and that is really how we learn to regulate our nervous systems, is through attunement and connection with another human being. And that is what's happening in therapy. And that's why I'm not really worried about AI therapists, or robot therapists, or even things like BetterHelp, because having an attuned nervous system is part of what is helping clients' nervous systems recalibrate. And then hopefully they are learning to then be that for themselves in their relationship to themselves.
Okay. Yeah, I knew AI has been out about a lot of things, but I didn't know they were having AI therapists. They're going too far.
It's coming, Alex.
They're going too
The
far.
robot therapists are coming.
Oh my gosh. I mean, come
They're, they say the right things. They say all the right things, the robot therapists, but
yeah, yeah. I
they
mean, if you
cannot
go by the
have
book,
an attuned system. That's what
yeah,
they can't.
the AI may know, the AI may can spit stuff from a book instantly, but it can't give, certain examples or situations that,
Yeah.
I don't know. Anyway, so how do you address trauma related to social injustice and spiritual abuse in your practice?
Yeah, gosh, that's a much more nebulous and abyss-like situation, right? Because you're talking about really systemic, big things, and if you're talking about microaggressions related to racism or related to anti-queerness or related to sexism or patriarchy or ableism, likely clients are experiencing those every day to some degree. And then you might have big T traumas that are related to maybe more overt things, or just the way that it shows up systemically in wealth disparity, in educational disparity, health disparities. That is traumatic. But it's not like oftentimes you can't point to this single incident, right? Like this thing happened and there you can do an EMDR session on it, right? Are you familiar with Resmaa Menakem? Do you know Resmaa Menakem at all?
Am I familiar with what?
He wrote My Grandmother's Hands. He's a Black psychologist that does a lot of work around racialized trauma.
Hmm,
And I
heard of
love,
it.
I would definitely recommend his book. It's a really beautiful book. But, he talks about, if you put a person in a traumatizing situation for long enough, their response over time is going to look like personality. And then if you put a community in a traumatizing situation, a traumatizing society for long enough, their collective response is going to look like culture. And he also talks about generational trauma. So we're just learning about what we carry generationally. And we can carry up to 14 generations of trauma encoded in our DNA. Some fucked up shit has happened in 14 generations, right? And so if you're in a white body, he talks about the white folks that came over to this country came over here from very brutalizing situations. They were not coming over here on the Carnival Cruise Line. They were coming over here from poverty and from rape and their communities being destroyed. And then white folks projected all of that dominance and brutality onto bodies of color and onto women and queer people and disabled folks in different ways, but predominantly on Black folks and indigenous people. And so white bodies have that ancestral trauma to deal with. And then, of course, bodies of color have the generations of trauma related to enslavement, the erasure of indigenous practice, etc. So oftentimes when we're talking about societal oppression, we're looking beyond just what has happened in your personal life. We're also looking at what might have been passed down generationally. And then, you can incorporate EMDR, but it's going to be a creative look at the protocol, right? So you could potentially use a picture of your grandmother. You could use just a picture that represents what your community has gone through. Maybe that if you feel some activation with it, it's worth reprocessing. So I think the trauma related to oppression, that's not going to be ever healed in some ways because we're carrying 14 generations of it. And we can find the corners of power that we do have, help our bodies digest and release what they can. And then we have to live in the world, and sometimes our trauma response, well, all the time, really, it's the right one, right? Not every place is safe for us. And so sometimes that vigilance or that armor or that keeping your distance is right, right? That's what the needed response is. But the more that we can make that conscious and it's a choosing, and we know that we have to do that, or we know that we're setting boundaries, and we certainly want to try to create communities that we do feel safe with. that we can take the mask off, that we can disarmor our hearts, then we can still create a life worth living, even as the world is still pretty freaking brutal out here.
I agree. I agree. So, can you discuss the significance of your courses, such as cultivate your inner badass and healthy hope?
Yeah. So, okay, so I have two courses that are really geared more towards therapists that are training therapists in how to work with those topics. So, those two courses, Healthy Hope, EMDR Best Practices for Spiritual Trauma. So, I didn't really touch on your question about spiritual trauma, but folks that have been raised in very toxic, shame-based religious cultures, or LGBTQ folks that have gone through like conversion therapy, or folks that are raised in really abusive cults that have maybe even had abuse from church leaders or clergy. That really adds a whole nother layer of trauma, right? Because if your perpetrator is a human, you have some hope that their power is limited. Someday they're going to die, right? Someday you're going to die, and at least you won't be suffering anymore. But if God or the divine is considered a punishing or perpetrative God, and you're being taught that everything that you are is wrong and sinful or whatever, there's some sense that there's no getting out of it. Right. And so that course is really focused on how to address spiritual trauma. And then I co-facilitate a course on healing racial trauma through somatic therapy with Dr. Chinwe Williams, who's a Black therapist that's based just outside of Atlanta. And we have an online course, but we also do trainings, especially for school counselors, how to address topics of race and racism in the schools. Okay, so I have those two courses. And then I have Cultivate Your Inner Badass, which is really more client-centered. And that is basically everything that I realized I'm saying multiple times in session. I like put that in a course. So nervous system regulation, how trauma is stored in the body, how to work with your attachment system, how to work with your body, and how to be in good relationship with human beings, how to set boundaries without being an asshole, how to really tap into collective healing and what that means, and not just look at your personal, not just look at your individual healing. We really have to start looking at what it means to work collectively and heal on a more collective level, because we do have personal nervous systems, but we also have relational nervous systems, and we have collective nervous system. And I would say our collective nervous system is pretty freaking traumatized. It's pretty organized around flight or fight. So that course gets into all of that good stuff.
Okay. Okay. So, on the flip side, so how do you approach the concept of getting into good trouble into your work?
Well, I think good trouble is using mindfulness and using a regulated-ish nervous system when we're talking about collective activism. And, I have to say, and I got to own that maybe this shift is a little bit rooted in privilege. Probably, even 10 years ago, 20 years ago, I was sort of angry protester on the front lines, tear this shit down. And I think my activism has become a little bit more subtle. It's become more in what do we want to create in the world, not just what do we want to tear down. But good trouble means knowing when to go against the status quo. It means knowing when to, as a white-bodied person, talk less and listen more. As an able-bodied person, talk less, listen more. Those aspects of my identity that give me systemic privilege. It means actually shutting up and listening more. Whereas aspects of my identity that maybe don't give me as much privilege, which is my queer identity, my identity as a woman, even my identity as an adoptee, although that's not really systemic power, but using your voice and finding the corners of power in those identities that maybe give me less systemic power. That's what I mean by good trouble. It's like when to speak up, when to go against the status quo, when to risk disappointing people or making people angry, even though that's not the intention. Risking that when that is rooted in wise mind and when the benefit of the collective is worth the risk.
So, what challenges, what challenges have you faced as an LGBTQ advocate, and how were you able to overcome them?
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly experienced some overt, you know, anti-queerness or whatever. My partner and I were denied housing, boss that was just very homophobic, and just those little microaggressions, right, every day. Just the dumb shit that people say when they're misguided and they're misinformed, right? And I also am a pretty femme presenting person. I probably pass as straight most of the time. I'm a cisgender person. And so that gives me a lot of privilege. If I was more masculine presenting, if I was a trans person, I think that I would probably have a lot more stories of overt anti-queerness, right? My biggest thing was I was raised in the church. I got rejected by that community. My birth mother, I reconnected with her when I was about 19, and she was a born again evangelical Christian, and told me that homosexuality was just as bad as murder because all sins are equal in the eyes of the Lord. And I just had to navigate that whole reunion and that family who was very does not believe that it's okay to be LGBTQ. And that relationship was also really important to me. So I think a lot of LGBTQ folks navigate relationships with people that they love that don't believe they have the right to exist or the right to marry or the right to have children. And I also think that the LGBTQ community has actually made really collective strides in a way that other communities, specifically communities of color, have not made, because people have gay people in their family. And it's really hard to hate people close up, right? So you might have been chugging along in your evangelical anti-queer beliefs, and then your son comes out and you are faced with, does that mean you're going to not have a relationship with your son? Does that mean you're going to disown them? And that I think that factor is probably one of the biggest factors as why the LGBTQ community has made big strides. You'll have Trump supporters saying they're they're LGBTQ allies or whatever. Like, your policy doesn't really match up. But, I think that is something that folks of color have not had that same push in the same way.
Yeah,
So,
I would agree. I don't, me personally, I don't understand how people just, I mean, we're all human beings at the end of the day. I mean, you
yeah.
should just love humans. And I mean, you shouldn't have to worry about what somebody else prefers. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? I feel like for you to be concerned with what somebody else prefers, that's none of your business. You know what I mean? Like,
It would seem that would seem logical, but
yeah,
here's how I couch that is people, the brain, the limbic system loves black, white, good, bad, safe, not safe, right, wrong, binaries. And we love a sense of righteousness and certainty. And that is when we view someone as other, the brain goes danger. The brain goes not good. The brain goes wrong. And so until we can see, or until we start building a culture of how do we make repair for past traumas, one, and actually hold each other accountable for those. But also, how do we begin to see each other as safe? How do we begin to treat each other with dignity and respect and hold the messiness of humanity in our frontal lobes? And that will allow us to show up regulated.
I don't know. I just feel like you know with this particular situation with people worried about you know whether what somebody likes is right or not. I feel like that's something that you should be able to have the brain power to just say, hey, this that's their life. It's not my life. I'm not the one that has to live it, regardless of if you think it's right or wrong. I feel like people should have the brain power to just say, hey, whatever you want to do, that's your life. You have to live it. I'm not living your life. I'm living my life.
Right.
So, I mean, I feel like that's just weak minded people are going to worry about what other people are doing or worry about, oh, if that's right or wrong when almost everybody in the world has done something that people would consider a sin.
Mm-hmm.
So how can you judge somebody for that? You know what I mean? I don't.
Yeah.
And then you're not supposed to judge. We're not supposed to be
That
able to
too.
judge people.
Yeah.
But that's a sin in itself. But anyway, we can go on about that for days. But you did say something that kind of sparked me a little. So you said you reconnected with your birth mother,
Yeah.
and then basically she told you that that being a part of the LGBT community was a sin just like as bad as murder and things like that. So in
Mm.
that moment, or when that came up, like how did that make you feel, considering the fact that like, hey, you're my birth mother, then I was adopted, and then now we reconnected, and then now for you to tell me this, like how did that feel? How did you
Yeah, it
take
was
it?
brutal. I mean, it was, so for a lot of adopted kids, for a lot of adoptees, we really kind of subconsciously already feel rejected. Most adoptees view, like, almost all relationships are seen through the lens of rejection, and something is wrong with me. And then to have my birth mother say that on top of that injury already, one, I'm very grateful that I was raised with the family that I was raised in. My adoptive mom was very, very supportive. And slash, but there's still a part of you that wants acceptance from your birth parent, right? That wants reconnection, that wants love. And so, yeah, when she said that, it was just like sort of another tear on my heart, right? And I'll be honest, I actually cut contact with her for about 4 years, and then I slowly just reconnected. And then when my partner and I got pregnant, um, with a known donor and all of that, and my birth mother really wanted a relationship with her grandchild. And so I had to set some very strong boundaries with her. I'm like, you're not talk disparagingly about LGBTQ folks. You're not allowed to evangelize around LGBTQ stuff, with me or in front of the kids. Um, and, she was actually able to respect those boundaries for the most part. Um, she died 2 years ago, and it was very hard for her that we were not, that we're not Christian, that we're not raising the kids in the Christian church. Um, and I understand that, I understand that she was scared for our eternal souls and such. And, I always say, like, we were each other's practice in unconditional love. I think it was really hard for her to have a relationship with us and see that, she was able to say, like, you are raising the most amazing boys, like, you guys are the best parents. And at the same time, she didn't come to our wedding. She couldn't celebrate our union. It was just this really hard relationship.
I mean, I can only imagine. I mean, it's just I just I feel like the world is so much different than it used to be. It used to be normal for people to look down upon, you know, if you wasn't heterosexual. You know what I mean? It was so easy for
Right.
people to look down upon it, and so people wasn't, freely, they wasn't freely open to just coming out with it or talking about it or things like that. But like now, I just feel like I don't understand why people still look sideways at people, because they're not heterosexual. When, I mean, some of the most powerful people in the world, you know, aren't heterosexual. So I don't understand. But the world is different now. So the more time goes on, the more people get used to it, and it won't be, you know, a thing for people to frown upon anymore. So
Yeah, I hope that's true, not just for the queer community, but for all folks who have experienced a lack of systemic power, right?
mhm.
Because at the end of the day, people can believe what they want to believe on a personal level, but when it bleeds into and when it turns into a systemic issue where you don't have access to healthcare, where you don't have access to, you know, bank loans, where you don't have access to housing, where you don't have access to education, where you don't have access to, uh, providers that understand your lived experience, that's where it becomes a really big problem, right? I can handle it when personal people have their opinions or whatever. What what we look at in terms of, the trauma related to oppression isn't necessarily the personal ish that people have. It's really more of that systemic impact that lands on people's bodies.
um, so you're doing a lot. So how do you balance your roles as a clinician, consultant, and a trainer all at the same time?
Yeah, and a mama and a
Yeah, that too. That
and
too.
and I direct musical theater at an elementary school.
Yeah.
Yeah, I I'm a wild one. I won't say that I have it in balance, Alex, truly. I think the best that I can do is be in an examined and curious state about it. But in terms of professional, I just sort of go with whatever's coming my way. Like if an opportunity to do a training comes, then I shift clients over here, and if they need referrals, then I will. But usually trainings are just like a weekend or whatever, right? And then in terms of supervising other therapists or offering consultation, that's just, I just kind of fold that into my client hours, and that all just sort of works itself out. Yeah, so I kind of try to stay in my own spiritual practice of trust that things are unfolding exactly as they need to. And, I try to take a break from time to time and try to rest from time to time and try to remember to have some fun from time to time, hang out with my kids and not look at my phone or check my email. Uh, you know, and I'm doing that all very, very imperfectly.
Well, I understand that, but all you can try to do is the best that you can. It's anytime you're doing multiple things, it's gonna always be hard
Yeah,
to
yeah.
balance it for sure. So can you share a success story of maybe the first person that comes to your mind when you think of someone who had a significant change to your method?
Oh, yeah. Oh gosh, there's so many.
But the one that stands out the most, like the first one that just comes to your mind.
Yeah. So I'm thinking of two, but they both have sort of similar parallels. So they both came from extremely shame-based religious backgrounds, both female identified people. And so I'll kind of do an amalgamation of those two clients. So, I had one client who was the victim of childhood sexual abuse within the church by a church leader. And then when she was then later sexually assaulted and disclosed to a different church member, church leader, both about the sexual abuse and about the sexual assault, and was blamed for that. The church leader told her that if she wasn't such a sinner, then this wouldn't have happened. And as a result, she actually worked as a sex worker for a while, was again sexually assaulted by one of her clients, and went to his trial, went to wrote advocacy. She was very kind of what we call Stockholm syndrome. It was like she was really connected still to her perpetrators. She was still in touch with church leaders. And so after she worked with me, we kind of deconstructed some messaging around the church. And she was really, I worked with her for a couple of years, but over the first year, she really unhooked from all of these relationships. And she couldn't even, we would do EMDR reprocessing, and she would say something like, I don't know, I don't trust it, but it feels different, right? and then, and then she would break up with abusive boyfriends, and she would, slowly her relationships would get a little healthier and a little healthier and a little healthier. She started setting boundaries with her parents, like her mom would try to engage her in conversation about her past. And she was like, I'm not going to engage in this conversation with you, because her mom would still sort of fold in that blaming spiritual abuse stuff. She was just more able to stay in her body. She would dissociate a lot. She would, especially during sex, she would just completely check out. Or if she was in conflict, or if she felt especially like men didn't like her or weren't connecting with her, she would get very, very anxious, and then she would just completely dissociate from her body. So, the biggest shift with both of the women that I'm thinking about was this graspiness, especially towards men, was able to soften, and they were able to have more reciprocity in relationships, more equity in relationships. And they just were setting more boundaries within relationships, and they weren't putting up with toxic, abusive bullshit anymore. So those are my favorite stories, right? Where people who almost, they know the abuse isn't right, but there's a part of us that internalizes it. There's a part of us that's like, this is my fault, or I should have done something different, or maybe I deserved it, or this is because I'm not enough, or it's because I'm broken. And then we really start not through convincing ourselves, but we start reprocessing the trauma, and those beliefs naturally start to shift, and we start to really be aware of our own inherent worth. And that's always inspiring.
Um, so let's talk quickly about your book. So your book that's coming out, what's the name of it?
So the book is called Always Enough, Never Done. And as it stands right now, the subtitle is called Embodied Badass Healing. But I'm not totally sold on that, so we'll see. But Always Enough, Never Done. And it really is kind of based on this premise that we are always and already enough, lovable, worthy, interconnected to all living things on the planet. And we have work to do. You got to look at your shit. You got to look at your trauma. You got to look at your grief. You got to look at your resentments. You got to look at your shadows, or it will leak out somewhere, right? So it's sort of that both and of always enough, never done. And it kind of follows a similar trajectory as the course. We talk about nervous system regulation, the attachment system, how trauma shows up in addiction, chronic pain, things like that. And then I'm actually splitting it into 2 volumes. The second volume will be more about relationships, boundary setting, and then that collective piece around nervous system regulation and how that shows up in the collective and in those systems of oppression. So yeah, I'm excited.
Let's see. Can you discuss the role of courage in leadership and personal development?
So I think courage, what we think of as courage, might not be what I think, what I'm talking about when I'm talking about courage. So I think leadership really needs the courage to admit when they've made a mistake, to take accountability, to show that mistakes are required for learning, to really have the courage to show up in honesty and in authenticity and in vulnerability, not to pretend like they have it all together and that they're perfect. So the courage really is about being honest, showing up with the value of accountability, um, and being able to admit when you're wrong. And I think the old style of leadership that's really top down, pejorative, I'm the boss, that kind of leadership really just isn't going to work anymore. So I equate courage with creating that culture of growth mindset and accountability.
Okay. Okay. So last thing before we get out of here, let's see. Let's go with. Can you share a personal practice or ritual, habit, or whatever whatever term that you want to use that you find essential for maintaining your own empowerment?
Well, I think it's a combination, right, of things. But if I could offer maybe one thing for your listeners, um, one, I think real nervous system regulation is probably going to have to involve some sort of body practice, whether that's twisting or just rolling out your joints or shaking it out or whatever. The trauma is held in the body, so finding something that helps you move your body in a way that you feel a little bit of a shift with movement, some sort of grounding practice, like whether that's just pressing your feet into the ground or even just calling to mind or imagining like a tree and you have sort of roots going down, just feeling a sense of gravity. I would say also just like this idea of supportive touch. So even just bringing a hand to your heart or a hand to your belly, of like where you're feeling something. This can be like just a really easy practice of like, whatever I'm feeling, there's room for it here. It's okay to feel it. Bringing some breath there. That would probably be my go-to alchemy, if you will, right? So uh supportive touch, grounding practice, movement, and then there's always the good old-fashioned deep breath, you know, deep breath.
Okay. Okay. Perfect. So, is there anything else that you would like to share with the audience before we?
Just check out my website. There's tons of free resources. Avos counseling.com. I'll send you a bunch of stuff you can put in the show notes, like free resources for people if
Perfect.
they want to download that. Um, and yeah, stay in touch. I would love to hear from people, and um, yeah, I'm here. I'm here if you need coaching, consulting, if you're a therapist, or if you're just a client looking to connect. I'm happy to be a resource.
So, I want to take this time to tell you that I appreciate you for coming on today, and sharing everything with the audience.
I appreciate you too, Alex. Your podcast is great. You're just like, you are churning things out, putting lots of good in the world. It's awesome.
Yeah, try my best to.
Yeah.
um, So, everybody that's watching, you guys have just watched another episode of All in All Alex. I want you guys to go to the notes, to the description, wherever you're listening or watching it. Go to Miss Erica's website. Check out all of her information. Follow her on social media. Check out all the free information that's down there as well. Just support her in any kind of way. But you guys have just watched another episode of All in All with Alex, and we'll see you guys in the next episode.